Clearly, I'm not the person who mans the controls. My name is Peter Hooper. I'm the Associate 4-H Agent for Cochise and Santa Cruz counties. And I am really excited about this presentation today. I do want to go over a couple of things with you guys. I think it's first and foremost, it's really important to think about all the great things that we do with science and agriculture and STEM in agriculture to make our lives more efficient, make our lives better, and be able to provide a better, safer environment for everybody. So that said, a little bit of housekeeping before I pass it over. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen. You can just ask your questions there. You can also use the chat feature if you have something that you just want to ask one-on-one. If you would like to ask me something to ask Dr. Green, we can do that as well. I am really excited to introduce our own Arizona 4-H ambassador for STEM, Elissa Sumner. She's from Greenlee County, and she will be introducing our presenter for today. Elissa?
Hey guys. So have you guys ever wondered how in the world can a horse survive and adapt in a natural environment that can range from 115 degrees Fahrenheit, which is flaming hot, to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, which is super cold? Most of the time, they live in one or the other extreme. But today, we're going to meet someone who's worked with and cared for horses at both ends of that temperature scale. And we will learn some of the science behind how horses are able to thrive in both extremes and look at some research studies done on how horses use shade when it is hot outside. Today with us, we have Dr. Betsy Green, professor and state extension horse specialist at the University of Arizona, to help us understand some of these methods horses have to create or dissipate, which means get rid of, heat naturally.
Okay, well, let me share my screen. I'm glad to be here and talk to you guys about some horses and how they handle the weather and temperatures and everything else. So let's share my screen and make sure we got that all going. Okay, so now we will put it in slideshow. Is that in slideshow? No, come on, there you go. How's that? Everyone see everything okay? Perfect. Okay, so 4-H Science in Ag. We're going to talk to you about horses, which of course everybody loves, or they should. And then we're also going to talk about how they handle some of these extremes in temperature and don't even think about it when they're doing it. So whether it's frosty or flaming, we're going to talk about horses. So that's actually a calf barn, and no calves were hurt, but people crawled in through there and dragged the calves out. That's in Vermont. And I was the equine extension specialist at University of Vermont from 2000 until December 15, which is when I came here. I had also actually done my master's here at the University of Arizona, so I'm a wildcat from a long, long time ago, probably before any of you except for maybe Peter were born. Got you with a mouthful. So anyway, that barn right there, if you look to your left, you can see that red wall and the little roof there. Well, just across from that was the new facilities. And thank goodness our horses were just fine, but we have to deal with a lot of snow in Vermont. We had, I think, in Burlington, we had about 70 inches per year average. Sometimes it came down quite a bit at a time. And we, you just kind of learn to deal with it, just like we learn to deal with the heat. But I'll tell you, any of you guys that have ridden in covered arenas or indoor arenas, in the winter in Vermont, or actually in the early spring, you could have one heck of an exciting ride when you're riding around, whether it's English, Western, whatever you're doing, and you're trotting around or jogging around, and all of a sudden the snow melts enough that it starts coming off that tin roof, and it sounds like you're in a hurricane with a train coming at you, because it just goes ba 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 ba, and all hits the ground. So you will find out if you have a good solid seat when that happens, or a good solid horse, or hopefully both. So that's the cold side of things. And I would be driving home from work, fairly late at night there, and I would watch my temperature. I had a temperature monitor in my car over top of the radio, or maybe it was in the rear view at that time. And I'd watch it drop 10 degrees from campus to my house, because I lived out a little bit further and a little bit higher. So it got colder. And there were times when I was trying to open my mailbox to get my mail on the way into the house, and it was minus 22 degrees temperature, not counting wind chill. Temperature, straight temperature. It's cold. And I can tell you, just like you guys all know here, it's pretty hot here at times, and this is kind of the hot time of the year. I would rather deal with the heat than the minus 22 when you're trying to go out and water horses. So just a couple of, couple of benefits there. There's pluses and minuses to everything. And so things that would happen when it was cold, horses they would stop drinking water as much. And suddenly we would have a colic because they were not drinking enough water. And so they'd get an impaction. So you'd have a lot higher impaction colics a lot of times just as it was starting to turn cold, and then as it got colder and colder. So, we could have impaction colics where there's not enough water in our horses in Arizona, but it's usually for a different reason, because they have been, not drinking enough or sweating too much and losing water. So a little different angle, but the same type of disease. So I got a question for you. It's chat time, and Peter's going to have to help me once he gets some answers there. So I want you guys, what do we have? Do I see we have like 15 or so on here now?
It looks like we have about 6 attendees. 6
attendees. Okay, well, we want something. There must have been comments or something that showed me 15 popping up on my screen. We want even you guys, if you want to put your words in the chat. Here we go. 2-minute drill. We don't have football going on. I'm a big football fan, but I want to know, how do horses get rid of excess heat? I want you to put that in the chat. I'll give you a minute or two. Alyssa, you hop in there, and oh good, I see some numbers. That must be the chat things, numbers that are popping on the top of my slides. Caroline, I expect something from you too, young lady. And Alyssa and Peter too. So Peter, what kind of things are we getting?
We're getting an awful lot of sweat. Sweating. Sweat.
Okay, we can make a song out of that, right? Okay, well, we'll come back to that in one sec, because we got another question for you after this next slide. So just so you know, Arizona has power. It has horsepower. We have a boatload of horses and a boatload of people that love horses and love working with them, riding them, have them in their business, racing, you name it. The Arizona Horse Council, at the last count that they've published, we have about 177,000 horses in the state that are counted as far as like owned and such. And that industry is worth about $1.6 billion, not million, billion. And now some of you guys that have horses probably can start thinking, I contribute to that, because what did I spend on my bridle, my English saddle, my Western saddle, my gaming gymkhana, my, let's see, every kind of brush in the universe. Oh, wait, hay and trucks and trailers and fences and everything else that you need to keep your horse. So that is direct which would be things like that, you know, working directly with the horse, but also indirect, the things that support the horse industry. So indirect could even be like a veterinarian. So anybody ever had vet bills? If you've had a horse, you've had vet bills. Or it could be a horse masseuse. It could be someone doing acupuncture, chiropractic, or massage, or farrier, or anything else. All of those things are indirect, but they're still part of the horse industry. And of course, in Arizona and in a lot of the West, we have a large wild and feral horse population. And so they sometimes cause a problem because their feed sources down so far that they end up having trouble. They eat so far down that the feed sources don't grow back. So that's always a contentious issue, but that's for another day. So we have very broad industry. We have working ranches. We have people that are working their cattle with their horse. If they took a four-wheeler or anything out in the pasture, they'd have a flat tire from Cactus before they ever even got too far. We have racing, quite a bit of racing. And of course, at the University of Arizona, we have the racetrack industry program, which I don't know, there's been a couple of small time racers like Bob Baffert, who won the Kentucky Dirt with the Triple Crown 2 times after it hadn't been won in, I think, 35 to 40 years, 73, I think, or 77 was the last year until a couple of years ago. Todd Pletcher, lots of big names have come through this program and are very supportive as well. So if you have any interest in the horse industry for racing, whether it's training or in the business of racing, we have the place for you to come. You know, rodeos, we have a rodeo team. Recreational riders, we have the largest top-rated dude ranch in the country, and that's Tank Verde Guest Ranch. And they have, depending on the season, they have anywhere from 120 to 200 horses on site there. So if you're ever in Tucson and want to go out for a trail ride, they have the place. And then, of course, at the University of Arizona, our horses used to be at the Campus Ag Center, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But right now, they've moved about a year ago, August, they moved out to the Almara Equine Center. And so the cool part about that is that's an 88-acre facility that used to be owned by Basie Tankersley, who created the Almara Arabian line. And those Arabians are known for their versatility. So they can do the high, head high, nostrils flared, ears forward, showing in halter, or they can jump courses, or they can do endurance, or whatever. So it's really pretty cool. And when we had that farm donated to us, we also, and this was before I came here about 4 years ago, we also had an agreement put in place where we would have 20 of their Almara broodmares, and then we would breed to stallions, and the foals would become University of Arizona horses. So that means that the students, so students in the equine program and other students as well in the classes, can actually be involved from the breeding to the birth to the, Alyssa, are you upside down? There we go. It's like she's falling or, but so from the birth to the handling them as weanlings to the handling them as yearlings and classes to breaking and training to showing even. And so we're just trying to get a lot of that stuff all in line as we finally got to move the horses to the Almara Equine Center. And cool part on that, oh, yes.
So we have a question here, Dr. Green.
Sure.
If you'd like to take a quick break to answer that. So the question is, I was wondering if it's safe to give a horse an electrolyte after they work really hard and are sweating hard. I barrel race and I'm constantly riding for hours every day. If I were to give an electrolyte, how often and how much for a 1,000-pound horse? Would you recommend a paste or a water electrolyte?
Well, I'll tell you what, let's get through this presentation because at the end we have some heat stress info, bringing it back to the horses. And then we'll I think we'll address some of that and then we can answer it further if it's not. How's that?
Awesome. All right, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so anyway, and if you want to see some of those Elmara horses, you can actually look at July 28th. We're having an online sale of 14 of them. Addis, ADDISS, or ADDIS, Addis Online. Look it up. You can see the horses, see some of the Elmara horses that came from our place that will be sold the 28th. Well, you can buy one if you want to. Peter, maybe you can get one or two. So, next one. How do horses protect against frigid cold? How do they protect themselves against frigid cold? Chat time. See a couple answers popping in there. What do we got there? There's 20, a couple more. Okay, what do we have there, Peter, for some answers? Oh, another one popped in.
We're seeing an awful lot of grow their hair out. My guess was blankets.
Okay.
But, I'm thinking it's probably grow their hair out.
Okay, well, both can be right. So, here's the answers to both questions. It's the same answer, but it's different actions. Okay? So horses naturally adapt to whatever their environment is. So horses can move in a trailer or traveling on their own from hot to cold, cold to hot. But they have different physiological mechanisms to get rid of heat or to hold on to it if it were in Vermont. So when you think of getting rid of heat, talk about evaporation. You guys, everybody's pretty familiar with sweating if you've been in Arizona at all. And this is actually taking, the fluid that's coming to the surface and converting to gas, as in like water vapor, and it allows that horse to get rid of heat by getting rid of hot fluid, which then it helps cool that horse down. Radiation, this is actually transfer without touching. So horses get heat by radiation in Arizona from doing what? Anyone guess? How about standing in the sun? You stand in the sun and you are getting heat via radiation. Now, if you're in the cold Vermont temperature and weather, same thing. You could stand in the sun and gain some heat as well. But if the wind's blowing or if it's raining or snowing and wet, then you could lose more than you gain. So another way to get radiation is just, having the horse eating quite a bit. And so when they eat, their digestive tract is generating heat as they're processing the food. And so one of the tricks that you do in cold, very cold winters days is give the horses some extra hay, because then they'll actually just eat that hay mid-afternoon in between their morning and evening meals, generate heat inside out from their digestion. And so that can actually help horses stay warmer in the winter in Vermont. Convection, so a nice breeze can just be a beautiful way to take the edge off the hot weather, hot day. And when there's no wind and it's standing still, it can be miserable. So, of course, if you're in Vermont and it's winter and the wind's blowing, you are just freezing, shaking, and your fingers, you can't feel them. So opposite extremes, but, and then the last, conduction, and that's like cold hosing is a great example. You're putting cold water on them to help them, it's touching. So it's getting cold hose, puts cold water, allows that to cool the horse off, and also allows to dissipate the heat as well. And we'll talk about some of the benefits on pluses and minuses. Quick question. How many of you guys think that you must scrape your horse when you're, like you put cold water on them and have to use the sweat scraper to take that water off to cool them off faster, or don't? See if we have any ideas. Because some people say you must scrape the horse. If it's too hot, you hose it down, scrape the water off to get the hot water off. And then some people say, no, just keep running the water.
We have a comment that says, that's true, always use a sweat scraper. Somebody else said, don't. Somebody else said, yes.
Okay, so there's actually been research where somebody took, you know, a thermography meter where they're measuring the heat. So like if it's hot, it shows up red. If it's colder, it shows up blue on that screen when you run that across the horse. And they did studies, and they showed that if you don't scrape, that actually cools them faster. You know, so you don't have to scrape the hot, you just keep the cold running and it'll cool them faster. So you depend, and now should you not scrape your horse, you can scrape your horse if you want to, but that doesn't, but the research showed that continuous water actually cooled the horse as well, faster. Now, those people that did that study did not necessarily pick up a hose in Arizona, because what do you have to do when you pick up a hose in Arizona to hose off your horse? You got to wait at least a couple minutes so that's not boiling when you put it on your horse, right? So those are different ways. So as far as the, let's see, radiation for the horse in the Vermont, they do grow their long coat, but then they actually, when it gets really cold, you'll see that they poof out their hair coat because it allows the warm air to stay closer to them. So they actually hold on to warm air with a poofed out long coat. It's really quite interesting. And of course, Arizona horses grow winter coats too. Now, Vermont horses would look at Arizona horses and say, what are you guys doing? It is not even cold there, but it's all where you live. So here's a little bit of an example for you guys as far as heat gain. So things that we talked about, solar radiation, it's hot when they're standing in the sun. Eating that extra hay, it is generating heat from the inside out. Also exercising, so muscle contraction. That muscle contraction can actually cause generation of heat. Now that can be good in Vermont, but that could be a little too much for that barrel racer that was asking about electrolytes, if their horse is getting so much heat and not cooling off. And so then we have reflected solar, when it's hitting the ground and then coming from the bottom. Then we have thermoradiation from the heat. So that would be when the horse is either lying on the ground and it's hotter on the ground. Cattle actually have problems. If any of you guys were here yesterday for Dr. Diaz's talk, they actually have a hard time. They're not as good as horses are at dispersing heat. And so when they're, you know, they chew their cud, they go eat their breakfast, lay down, sternal recumbency, so on their chest, and they start chewing their cud and they process their feed better than horses can, but they can't get rid of that heat. And so when they're lying down and that ground is really hot, they can actually go into heat stress pretty quick. So food for thought on that. Now here on the right, you have heat loss. So radiation and convection, depending on if it's cold, evaporation of the sweat, respiratory heat loss, breathing. They don't necessarily pant like dogs, but they will increase their respiration to try and remove heat from their body. and then also conduction. So here's some different examples of what we've been talking about. Now, what I bet you didn't know is a horse has an air conditioner. I kind of wish we had an air conditioner, but I would not say that it works great, but it can really help cool the brain. So all of the sinuses, you know, if you knock on your horse's forehead, you can hear the kind of hollowness from where the sinuses are. So you have your frontal, superior maxillary, inferior maxillary, nasal cavity. All of these sinuses bring air that can actually cool the venous blood, so the blood going back to the heart, and can actually cool it down. And then the cooled blood goes to a sinus at the base of the brain. So your horse has a built-in air conditioner to help a little bit. Now, when you get to drastic heat, it's not going to be enough to keep up. And that's when you'll have heat stress.
Hey, Dr. Green?
Yes.
We have a question about when is the normal time for a horse to finish shedding and start growing a coat in Arizona?
Well, so typically once the weather starts to change, and, you know, for us, it's warming up, and, you know, then they start shedding out. I think they're probably starting to shed anywhere, depending on where you are in Arizona, first of all, because if you're in Flagstaff, it's going to be different than here in Tucson. But around here in Tucson, they're shedding, you know, gosh, in February, March, sometimes even January, and they might finish out probably in April-ish. But there are some physical conditions that can cause them not to shed, which is a medical condition. But beyond that, normal shedding is usually around February, March, April.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Green.
Yeah. And then, you know, reverse, when it starts getting a little bit cooler, they start growing hair coats. Even if it's not, in Vermont terms, they would think it's beautiful. Okay. So talking about how a horse deals with it, with temperature, you have to always consider humidity. Now in Arizona, we have a fairly low humidity. And that's why it's like, well, it's a dry heat is what everyone says. And that's true to a certain point. But when it comes down to it, if it's 110, it's still hot, okay? But if you go to Vermont and it is 80 degrees and 80% humidity, you are a whole lot more miserable than you are in 102 with about 13% humidity. I can guarantee it. I've lived it. And Peter's nodding like he knows that too. Those are the times when you get out of the shower, you put your jeans on and you can't, they're still wet. You're wet all over again just because it's so humid. So this little guide that was put together by Krishona Martinson at Minnesota says, okay, if you take the air temperature in Fahrenheit and the relative humidity, which of course is a little higher right now because it's monsoon season, but add those together and it can help you understand how good your horse will be at cooling themselves through all the things that we just talked about. If it's 130 to 150, so say it's 100 degrees and 20% humidity, then that's still not there. If it's 130%, then they're gonna get a little bit decreased efficiency. They won't be able to keep up with it. So now what did we say? Vermont, I said 80, right? So 80 degrees and 80% humidity, that's 160. So at 80 degrees in Vermont, they can actually have a lot harder time cooling off than you can at 102 with your horse and 15% humidity. So it's interesting to think about that. And then of course, if you're talking 90 and 90 degrees, 90 humidity, or 100 and 80% humidity, that could be fatal if they're stressed. So this is one thing that can give you an idea. And there's the link to that, extension.umn.edu, but you can actually just look up Minnesota and horse extension and probably find it. So Now you take that back to the cattle, and I told you they don't cool off very well. And so on this chart on the right, you see on the left-hand column is degrees Fahrenheit from 72 down to 107. So it should go further for us, right? And then on the top you have the percent relative humidity up to 90%. So if we go to Vermont and we go 80 to 80, then that temperature humidity index, which is what this chart is helping you figure out, it's a information for you as to how stressed your animal might be, is about 78. Now, if we go to today, it's supposed to be what, about 101, I think? And we probably have a higher humidity because of the monsoons. So that's in the red zone, okay? And when you look at the temperature humidity index, which tells you a lot, 72 to 78, that dairy cow is getting under mild stress. 79 to 88, moderate. Above 98, down here in this white corner, the lower right corner, you have dead cows. So this is also informative for your horse. And so the previous one said, okay, how it gives you an idea on whether they're stressed. But now here we have this box right here. I'm going to tell you, remember that box. So 82, 83, 84, 85. I'll come back to that. Now, how do we measure if horses like to use shade or not? And we'll talk about temperature humidity index while we do. In the vet science department at University of California, Davis, they did some studies where they used, it was actually a beef, their beef research pens. So you can see in the lower left there, there's a half cover of shade and half that's not covered. So that's what this represents. Half is in shade, half is not. They wanted to test how often the horses chose that shade. And so they tested that, and to make sure they didn't have any problems, they put water in both places. And they separated them. They had a vacant pen in between so that it wasn't like Bob talking to Sam over the fence. And they measured the observation greater than chance. So if it's all chance, it should be about 50-50, right? They spend half the time in the shade and half the time not in the shade. So their observations were percent greater than chance on this axis, the y-axis, and then the time of day. So we went from 9 o'clock to 1800, so that's 4 o'clock the afternoon. And then they showed the solar radiation, and that's this dotted line. So you can see as it gets closer to noon and 1 and 2, solar radiation is a lot higher, the highest, sun's in the sky. The time in the shade was actually high in the morning. It went down when the radiation was higher. That doesn't seem to make sense, does it? And then it was up at about 4 o'clock. Okay, so Peter, what are they saying in the chat? I see chats pop up, but I can't see them because my screen doesn't show it.
Oh, that's the 1800 would be 6 o'clock p.m.
18, you're right. See, that's good.
Which makes that even more interesting, what you're talking about with the radiation being up.
So can anyone
why would
guess?
radiation be up so high at 1600 or at 8
Oh,
at 6
no.
o'clock?
This dotted line is the radiation. That's good. I'm glad you asked that.
Oh.
This is the time that they're spending in the shade. So when the sun is the highest and the radiation is the highest, they're spending less time in the shade.
Huh.
Anyone in the chat, can you guys guess why they might be in the shade at the morning and at 6 o'clock, so dusk? That's a hint. Dusk. What happens at dusk?
Oh.
All the insects come out. So that data, which doesn't seem to make sense, you know, it seemed that they went in the shade when the bugs would be coming out at dawn and dusk. Kind of interesting, huh? Not what I think they were looking for. So now they did another study. They said, you know, but that was individual horses. Horses are usually out in groups. Let's see if we can do a study on that. And so here's the picture of their shelter, and it's a shelter big enough for about 3 horses. Here's the overhead view. So there's still empty pens between them. There's water in the same area, you know, one corner of the pen. There's enough room for the horses to be under the shade. You can see there's horses under the shade here. And so then when we look at their research, we've got percent shade use greater than chance on this one. And that is preference. So that's that blue line. And then we have, and so we went 9:30 to, who's my math here? 4 o'clock. That's the 4 o'clock I was looking for. I just didn't do math. But I'm glad someone caught me. And then the ambient temperature outside, or the ambient temperature, and then the actual temperature of the unshaded area is red. So the temperature went up. They still did not go in the shade. The temperature in the unshaded area was pretty high. So they still were not out in the sun when the temperature was high. This is temperature this time, okay? And it stopped before the dawn and dusk factor came along. Well, I guess they were coming out of the shade. So they say, well, aren't they just going in shade to get out from the heat? Apparently not. So then we came around, and this view is actually of the overhead of the Campbell Avenue farm at Campbell and Roger off of campus. And so if you go and buy meat at the meat lab, that's up here in the upper right. This is the Ag Research Center. The horse barns are here. And then these are the paddocks. And so we'll come in closer to these, but we use 2 paddocks from this long side. So this is north, the Catalinas. If you saw the bighorn fire, the Catalinas are up in this direction. So north, south, east, Campbell Ave, and west. Okay, so we're gonna look at these 2 pens and these 2 pens. So the objective of our study was to see, okay, if it's temperature, humidity index, are they gonna spend increased time near the shade structure and decreased overactivity during the time when it's really, really hot, okay, and the sun is high. That's what we wanted to see. So here's the victims, okay? And this was the cheat sheet because you had to know what they look like. And you say, well, how do you know what they look like with their fly masks on? Well, the whole point was that they always had their fly masks on, so we needed to be able to tell who they were. And so we had Danny in that number. I'll tell you what that is in a minute. But Chestnut, he was the herd leader. We had Enzo, was a big old warm blood with 3 socks in a blaze, not to be confused with Taz, who had less socks behind. And Cal was a Pasifino gelding. And then Gumbo, you can see he was the troublemaker. And this was because we had people that weren't used to working with the horses. In fact, Duarte helped us with this as well. And so we had to identify the horses. These were the geldings. And then we had mares. We had 6 mares that were used to being together. So we had Belle, who was the herd leader and would run everybody else off if you didn't pay attention. We had a flea bitten and then a gray mare. Now the gray mare had no right eye. So Nella, you had to make sure you knew, because if you go to the wrong side, you were going to scare her, and that was not good for either of you. Then we had Rena and Honor. So 6 mares, 5 geldings. They were in 2 different groups. They were used to each other. And what we did is we actually put GPS tracking collars on these horses. So Colt Knight, Dr. Colt Knight, who's a beef extension specialist up at the University of Maine, did his PhD at here at Arizona, at University of Arizona. And so we used his collars that he created, and we collected location and distance data in every 5 seconds for these horses, okay? And it was summarized hourly and daily, and we used the distance traveled based as an estimate of the horse activity. Okay, so here's a closer look at the collars. These actually are cow collars that they turn out cows and see, track where they're going out on the range and such as well. There's GPS monitors in these little things, and you had to unscrew them and take out the padding and all that. And so you can see the numbers, and that's what those numbers were related to. And when one of the collars stopped working, that's why one said an old such and such, new such and such. So here's a calendar. So just an example, our third period of data collection, we adapted, we moved them, let them adapt to their new place, which wasn't, they'd been in those pens before. And then we started collecting data on Saturday after they'd been in those pens 3 days, and collected for 5 days straight. Then we can move the horses to the next pen, take the collars off, give them 3 days, download the data, give them 3 days of adaptation, and go from there. So we collected in 4 pens. Each set of horses rotated through each of the pens, 2 days adaptation at least, and 5 days collection. We collected data 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. daily. And then we also got the temperature humidity data hourly from the local weather station, which is on the farm. So here's your 2-minute drill. You can use technology or not, but I want to know how many measurements were recorded per horse per day, collected at 5-hour intervals from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. You can use math, you can use your calculator, you can use paper. So, as you're thinking about it, 5 a.m. to 8 p.m., how many hours is that? 5 a.m. to noon. Alyssa, you want to get your unmuted and you can help us with the chat and tell me, because I can't see the chat because my screen is full.
Yep, it looks like 15 hours. We have an answer of 900 pieces of data collected, and it looks like we have 2 people who have said that now.
Okay, that's not correct.
No.
It's getting there. So if you have 15 hours, that's correct. And you say that you have how many minutes per hour? 60, right?
60 minutes in the hour, right?
And that's where they got the 900, was probably 15 times 60?
Yes, probably.
Okay, so then how many seconds are in a minute?
60.
Okay, so then take that 900, multiply that by 60 seconds per minute times
810,000.
10,800 or 8.
I've got 810,000.
Okay, I'm gonna do my math because I did it.
So 15 times 60 times 60.
15 times 60 times 60. I got 54,000. What do you guys have? 15 hours.
Oh, I've got 54,000. Yeah.
Okay,
yep, you're right.
I was gonna say. So good, you got caught doing bad math too. Okay, so that's
and we've
how
got
many.
a confirmation from one of the attendees.
Okay, good. So that's how many seconds are in the collection period. Now, how often did we collect? We collected every 5 seconds. So now you divide that 54,000 by 5 seconds, because we only collected every 5 seconds. And you'll get the number of data points per horse per day. So 54,000 divided by 5 equals what?
Is that 10,800 from one of the
Oh.
attendees?
Holy moly, huh? That's correct. That's one day, one horse. So that's a lot of data points.
And
Now,
you have 9 horses, right?
correct. 4 and 5, yes, or 5 and
So
6. 5 and 6, 11
97,000.
horses. Yeah, it's a
Oh.
lot of data. It filled up Excel spread 2 Excel spreadsheets, and I didn't know you could ever fill them up. Now this is a closer picture. So you see we have 2 shorter pens, the ones that go east to west, and then we have 2 longer pens that go north and south, okay? So north is to the right. Now here's Ashley, and it was her cow collars. So we had to, you can see they're a little big on the Arab mares especially, but we put them around the neck, and she was using our little cheat sheet so that we could put them on the right number on the right horse. So one interesting thing to think about with shade, it moves. So here is a shade out behind the the ag research lab. And you can see the shade is not under the shade at the certain points of the afternoon. And so you can see here with Booker, that shadow is pretty darn big. So we had to actually look and calculate based around the shade and figure out where the shade would move, and then see if our horses were in that area during that time of day. It was a lot of statistics. And so here you go. Here's a little bit of a version of the shade, and you can see not one of them, this is mares and foals, this is not our research horses, not one of them's under the shade. These guys are getting, what, convection, right? Because they're actually getting heat from the ground, and solar. So we analyzed from the morning, 5 to basically 10, 9:59, the noon, 10 to 3, and the afternoon, 3 to 8. We said, okay, behavior near shade, activity levels, the temperature, humidity index, and solar radiation. And so what we found with all that data, it all came down to small numbers. This is the morning session as the top one, the middle afternoon session, or the noon session, and then the afternoon. And so all that data came into how many minutes per period. So in the morning, those 5 to 10, they were spending 18 minutes per period by the shade. They spent more in the afternoon, or in the noontime, and more in the 3 to 8 p.m. And that was actually statistically significant. Let me talk. And then travel time, meters per period. So they actually moved more during the higher heat. And you can see the temperature humidity index. It was 74 in the morning, 80, and 79, which is, this was not different, but 74 was. Okay, so it was cooler in the morning, but they were still moving at noontime more. So as we just saw, THI was lower in the morning. Average activity level was higher at the noontime. Average time by shade was lowest in the morning, but even when it was really hot, they only spent 8% of their time by shade. So one of the things that we did, we actually started this because people were complaining that the horses did not have shade, because they didn't have shade in those paddocks till 2016. They'd been there, for years and years. And so they said they should be under the shade. They need shade. And, we're certainly not going to say horses shouldn't have access to shade, but they were saying they needed shade. And so shades went up. And so we started to measure and get some scientific data as to how much they were actually using the shade. And so they did not have movement to the shade when the temperature went up. And we had a lot of data. And so what we also found out is, here's another shade, and you can see the horses. They're not under the shade, okay? And I just want to show you what we saw. So this is a 2-hour period. I think it was Nella. It was a 2-hour period, and this is where she moved. So these are the measurements. And if they're darker or have thicker or stacked, that means that's where they were hanging out more. So this is a longer one, north-south. And that's 2 hours data points from one horse. Now let me show you what she did during one day That's a lot of data, huh? And you can see that she spent a lot of time down here at this end. The shade is about right there, but guess what's here? This right here is the feed road. And so they got hay supplemented in the morning and the night. And the water on this pen is over here and over here. So then we have to look, okay, was that hay, we couldn't not feed the horses because there was not enough pasture to maintain them. But did that impact our results? And it probably could have. So another thing that we do, herd dynamics. There's always the bossy britches in the pen and they run the other horses off the feed or the shade. There was no differences by their time spent by shade individually. So there weren't any bossy britches kicking the others out of the shade. We could do that scientifically with GPS. Limitations of the study, I showed you the paddocks were different. We ideally would like them equal of size. We had everything from a Pasofino to a couple of warm bloods to a bunch of Arabians. Excuse me. And then we had a lot of data in a very small area. So one of the things we did was we used our facilities to address the strong concerns, even though with the limitations, to say, hey, look, we've got data that shows these guys are only spending 8% by the shade. Okay. And so one of the suggestions was when we put the shades up, that wasn't good enough. We were supposed to tie the horses under the shade. And we said no. We did not. We're not going to force horses under the shade. They had a choice and they chose not to use it very much. But this is real data, and this is one of the things that you can use for your science. You can actually ask scientific questions and get some answers. And I think we thought they would have been under the shade a little bit more, but 8% of their time spent during the shade, and they spent the most of the time, in thermoneutral zones. Of course, they're regular temperature. That's how they're trying to get rid of or maintain heat, is to either sweat or things like that to get their temperature to stay in a normal range. Okay, and if you get too hot, then we're talking about heat stress. So normal range for the horse is what? About 99 to 100, 100.5. Okay, so if they start getting over that 105, they're going to try and sweat or get rid of heat or use shade or whatever. And then one of the things that we found out is our horses are adapted. They're adapted to the heat, just like we get adapted to the heat. When I came in from Vermont and we're out riding, I'm like, okay, I am not used to this heat anymore. And so it's like, I'm getting lightheaded. I wonder why. But now I'm adapted to it as well. Just as you guys would freeze in Vermont, you actually get used to it. And it's amazing that when it's March and it's 30 degrees and you're sitting there in a short sleeve because you're like, oh my goodness, this is beautiful. It's sun and it's not frigid. And of course, when it's 50 degrees here in Arizona, people have down coats on. So it's all getting adapted. So it makes sense with people. It also makes sense with horses. Now, just a quick couple things, bringing it back to the horse. Okay, we have skin pinch test for seeing if they're dehydrated, and also gum color and capillary refill time. These are vital signs that all of you guys, if you have horses, should know. Testing for hydration. Now, some veterinarians will say, oh, the skin pinch test isn't a good exact science. Well, it's not, but it's a start. It's something to tell you. If you grab in that area, this upper left here, and you see that, pull that skin out and it stays out, there's a good chance your horse has some level of dehydration. Okay, but the other thing is, if you look at the gum color and it's pale, then that could be dehydration. It could be shock. And if you put your thumb on that upper gum, push it, and then take your thumb away, it should actually come back. The color should come back to the pink or hopefully pink, in 1 to 2 seconds. If it takes longer, there's a good chance they're dehydrated. So that's finding, keeping track of your horse as you're going. And so then another thing, as far as treating heat stress in your horse, if your horse is showing signs of heat stress, then you definitely want to make sure that you stop, try and find shade if you can, take the saddle off if you're out in Saguaro National Monument or Park, and even walking in circles in a breeze, because a lot of times you're not next to a hose when you're out riding. Try and keep them cool. If you have some cold water, start at the head first. And if you have access to a hose, use the cooling methods. This next one has a bunch of stuff on it, just heat stress, okay? Things that you might see. They might be slowing down. They might act depressed. They might have a higher body temperature, the dehydration that we talked about, the skin pinch and the gum check, color and capillary refill time. Heat exhaustion, if there's greater than 6 seconds for capillary refill time, that is not good. Your horse is beyond heat stress. And now to exhaustion. And if their gums are dark red, could be heat exhaustion. When you're working your horse, and maybe our barrel person can, or people that are out riding a lot can understand this, that the horses will get like the thick, white, crusty sweat. That's electrolytes that are coming out with the sweat. So you're also not only getting dehydration, you're, taking away some of the things that help their body stay within their normal ranges. And so that's where your question with electrolytes. One of the things you can do is you can actually get your horse used to drinking electrolytes. So as far as if the electrolytes are in the water, you want to have a bucket with electrolytes, a bucket without. Because if your horse doesn't want to drink the electrolytes, you don't want to withhold water from your horse. Okay, you want them to drink the electrolytes too, but if it's one or the other, give them both options. Now maybe you're talking about like an electrolyte paste where you have like a dewormer tube with electrolyte looking, in it that you have with you. That could work. But the thing is, you want to go ahead and get your horse ready. If you're going to be working them that hard, have them have the option to have some electrolytes, take in the electrolytes on their own before you go out, and then also as you go, okay? Because if you're working your horse, I bet you probably would say, yeah, we've all seen that white, crusty, dried sweat. That's sweat with electrolytes, so the sodium and all the magnesium and things like that are coming out as they sweat. So it's not so much of a fix it, it's a prepare for it and then be ready for it if you take it further. That if it's hotter than you expected or longer than you expected, then you might add to it, but you want to keep them hydrated and potentially with electrolytes, especially if you're working them hard all the time. So rapid shallow breaths, large gulps of air if they're racing or running around a course. And then if their respiratory rate is greater than 60 to 80 breaths per minute, that's pretty stressed, because normal respiration can be 8 to 12 breaths per minute. So that's huffing and puffing. So all of those
Dr.
things
Green?
Yes.
Can you give them Gatorade for electrolytes?
If they will drink it, and what you can do is actually pour that in the water, but you don't do that at the time. You prep them with it. And that's actually one thing, especially when you're going to shows or strange places or clinics. Sometimes horses are really picky about their water. And so you can actually practice at home by starting to put some soda, some Gatorade, some apple juice, something in the water to have them get used to that taste, so that when you go to a strange place, you fill up water, you put a little apple juice in there, they're like, oh, okay, I'm used to that. That can actually help prevent problems by preparing. So on that, I'd be happy to take questions. trying to find the clock here, 11 o'clock, but I'm happy to take questions if there are any further. I hope you've enjoyed this.
We're getting thank yous, and yeah, if there's any questions, folks, please feel free to enter them in the chat or in the Q&A area here while we kind of close things out. Dr. Green, I really want to thank you so much for this presentation. It's been very educational and enlightening, and I think the really cool thing to see here is you take your expertise and you leverage the science behind what you know to be able to answer questions that you might have. You know, for example, looking at that the research on the shade and how prior to the GPS tracking, the only way to be able to tell was if you just happen to be walking by and looking at it, or, you know, going out and looking. And with this, you definitely know that those horses are not spending time in the shade. And how cool that can stimulate so many other questions now that you can then check with science. So thank you so much for that. That's really, really cool for this presentation.
Sure, my pleasure. My pleasure.
We have a comment here from one of the attendees that says, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this class and it was fun to learn and very interesting. Thank you so much. I will use many of these tips to use with my horse.
All right, excellent. And there's a lot of information out there. There are a lot of good articles from here and other universities, and even, you know, and veterinarians as well. Some of the heat stress stuff information was from a presentation that Dr. Ann Pearson and I gave at our Equine Health Symposium a year ago, January. And of course, if you want some more info there on the extension.arizona.edu here, I'll actually type it in here. Extension.arizona.edu/horse. I think it's horse, not horses. That has links to a lot of the different things from our 4-H information to our publications to some videos to you name it. And
very cool.
Feel free
awesome.
to. Oh, yeah, I'm glad you put that out there. It's like, oh, I put it to Peter privately. There you go. And so if there's
Dr. Green, this is awesome, awesome information.
Okay, and if you come to U of A, you can play with Arabians and others. The Morgans were at Vermont in the cold winter. So
awesome.
Thanks for
Dr.
having
Green,
me.
again, thank you so much for coming out to us, and anytime to talk to you is definitely an opportunity to learn a great deal of information, so thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right, take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.